Greetings and welcome once again to Aspects of Aliyah, brought to you from a very wet, windy and cold UK. Good to be back with you again after a break of a week or so, and we're picking up once again on our history of Israel, but this time not the history of Israel in the cold historical form, but looking at the three-stranded cord of God, land and people. So, the history of Israel is intrinsically bound within these three elements. So, firstly, we looked at how to approach these things. Then, secondly, we looked at the Eden narrative. And after we last met together, we looked at what is called the post-lapsarian period. What happened after Adam and Eve were expelled. We also looked at the death of Adam and the character of Eve. So now we're moving on to Genesis chapter 4. In a sense, Genesis chapter 4 is a preamble to Genesis chapter 5, which eventually leads to chapter 6, which I think is the most striking and challenging elements of the etiological narrative. Just recall, we said that the first 11 chapters of Bereshit, or Genesis, is an etiological history rather than a hard and cold history in the way that we understand it today. I mentioned it before, it's probably worth mentioning again. History as we understand it really doesn't occur until the time of Eusebius of Caesarea, and even then it wasn't really quite as we study today. But etiological history is a history that attempts to explain things in a meaningful way concerning life, death, and relationships with the divinity. So from that recap, let's quickly move on to Genesis chapter 4. Goodness me, a very short chapter, and some things that are very challenging, and I personally don't think have really been dealt with properly, largely speaking. And of course, is the story of Cain and Abel, or Cain and Abel. So, firstly, the text reveals to us that Adam knew his wife, Eve, and she conceived and bore Cain, saying, I have gotten, Canty, a man with the Lord. And again, she bore his brother Abel. That's Genesis 4, verses 1 to 8. Cain is named for the resemblance in the Hebrew language to the term for to gain or to possess. Reflecting his cry. Now, there's an element of debate as to whether Cain and Abel were twins or simply just brothers. The careful reader will note, however, that there is only one conception but two births. The Hebrew word for again, asaf, means to add something. In this case, the birthing of Havel was added to the birthing of Cain. Therefore, ipso facto, Cain and Havel may reasonably be considered to be twins. The thing I really love and enjoy about etymological history is wordplays and puns. So, let's look at the names. We looked at Cain, didn't we? Yeah. Now let's look at Havel. So, Havel is born and dies in 6 short verses. Echoed by his name, Havel means vapour or breath, which may be considered as a short form of the saying, in England, in English anyway, here today and gone tomorrow. Vapour in time. In fact, hardly worth mentioning in one sense. So, Havel, in the sense of vapour breath, appears in Proverbs 21:6, Psalm 39:5. And we could also look at 39:11, 78:33, 94:11, 144:4, and very interestingly in Job 7:16. So we've got these two characters, haven't we? The cry, the Lord has gotten a man, and also the Lord has given a vapour. Quite interesting, isn't it? So soon after Havel's death, Adam again knew his wife, Eve, and she bore a son and called his name Seth or Shet. For she said, God has substituted Shahat for me the offspring in the place of Havel. Genesis 4:25, verse 26. In common with other primeval narratives, it's considered that the notice concerning Cain and Abel is an abridged version of a much longer story, and a far more detailed story that circulated for centuries in the time before written documents. In other words, in various forms it circulated as oral history, oral etymological history, but it was probably a much larger, much more extended, more detailed story. So it's generally considered among scholars that the notice in Genesis 4 concerning Cain and Abel is a very shortened form. So there are some difficulties, again, in the whole text. I mean, 4:7 being the major tension. So I think if we move away from the sort of literary scholarly thing, we need to understand that the story of Cain and Abel is something a bit more than just a story with a moral. Yeah? So let's move on and let's turn to what I personally like to call the deadly narrative of Cain and Abel, because it marks an important shift from innocence to deception to rebellion and to murder. And I think one of the things we need to try and get our head around a little bit is along here is that jealousy plays an important part in this role. In Jewish scholarship, rather than Christian scholarship, the idea is that when the serpent arrives, the serpent is not the Satan, he's an accomplice of Satan, and the jealousy of Satan for Eve caused the whole problem. So in Jewish scholarship, the idea is there's a continuity of jealousy between the serpent narrative within the Eve narrative and also the Cain and Abel narrative. So, in general, a plain reading of Genesis 4:8 has been considered to indicate that the cause of the slaying was related to the matter of sacrifices related to in the previous verses. Now, it should be noted that this is the first notice concerning the questions of offerings and sacrifices, because offerings and sacrifices do not appear in the narrative and the post-lapsarian narrative until this point. So, Havel's sacrifice of sheep and its fat is treated in detail, is subsequently regarded as an important marker concerning the matter of sacrifices within ancient Israel's history of the whole cultus. In Genesis Rabbah 22:5, both the nature and the value of the sacrifice are emphasized. Abel's offering is accepted and Cain's is rejected. The reason for rejection is not included in any surviving texts in the canonical writings or the extra-canonical writings. Or, at one time prior to the final redactions of all these documents, is included, which is quite challenging, isn't it? Now, concerning the lacunae, lacuna is a posh word for missing bits or holes, if you want, the rabbis look for a reason when investigating how the sacrifices were defined in the text. This is quite important. Cain's sacrifice is somewhat dismissed as being of inferior quality. His offering was probably flaxseed or something similar, and also not bringing the first fruits of the figs, which is due to be a delicacy at the time, according to Isaiah 28:4 and Jeremiah 24:2. So the rabbinic idea is that Cain just picked the very first, cheapest, unnecessary thing and just brought it. There's no thought, there's no honouring, there's no consideration. In fact, it was, now listen to this carefully, it was a lack of appreciation of God's great gifts. There's a lack of appreciation for a relationship that did not just concern the external blessings of the land, but the land itself. So, if we look at our three-stranded cord, we can see the initial thing is that the God, land, and people trichotomy is being despised here. Very, very important. However, arguments of silence will always be tenuous. So, when we look at this question of sacrifices, which is the first time they arrive, there are some significant questions. Why was Havel mentioned first, even though Cain was the elder, and therefore he should have been mentioned first? Is it because the narrator wanted to show the offering of sheep was consistent with later practice in the temple, and thus assumed by the redactors to be God's preference? However, Cain did not follow what were later regulations concerning sacrifice. The text states that he brought fruits, and this is important, fruits, not first fruits, whereas Havel brought the firstlings of his flock. In addition, his timing of bringing the offering was not correct, and the contents were inferior. So this is how this whole thing is generally considered. And although, as I've said, by and large, the above view is considered to be the definitive comment on the text, personally, I think this is really badly flawed. So we'll come back to that after we've taken a break.
As a musician, I can tell you that timing is everything. The beat of the drum, the pluck of the strings, the tinkling of the ivories, or the strum of the guitar. If you want the music to sound right, then you have to play in time. And if you're joining with others, everyone needs to play at the right moment. You know, it's the same with what God is doing. Our Creator is playing a melody, and the theme of the song is protecting His children. But like any orchestra, it's important that as we join in, that we too get the timing right. You see, timing is everything. And now is the time to become part of the orchestra that God is assembling. Our God-given purpose is to support and stand with the Jewish people. This is the greatest song you could ever sing and the greatest music you could ever play. Won't you join with the band with Ezra International as we join with what God is doing? Remember, timing is everything, and that time is now.
Welcome back. So, scholars have often, more importantly, commented that the narrative is silent as to the reasons that Cain actually killed Abel. At the time of writing, obviously, there are no autographs or even ancient sources available, despite the many, many recent discoveries at Qumran and also Nag Hammadi, and also other recent archaeological discoveries that shed any light on the question. So, let's just delve into a little bit of speculation, shall we? Okay. Now, Gordon Wenham, who's a scholar that I appreciate, offered 5 suggestions gathered together by various scholars regarding the lack of details. Yeah, so they're verified, and I put one of my own in. So, firstly, God accepted Abel's sacrifice because He preferred shepherds. Now, that might sound a little bit silly. However, the great scholar Josephus in Antiquities said this: Adam and Eve had 2 sons. The elder was named Cain, which name, when it's interpreted, means a possession. The younger one was Havel, which signifies sorrow. How Josephus came with that, not entirely sure. They also had daughters. Now, the 2 brothers were pleased with different courses of life. For Havel, the younger, righteousness. He was a lover of righteousness and believed that God was present in all his actions. They excelled in virtue, and his employment was that of a shepherd. Okay, the above explanation is completely untenable, as illustrated by the notice that Adam was placed in the garden to cultivate and keep it. We looked at that, didn't we, earlier in Genesis 2:15. So, based on that argument, we could say that due to Adam's divine appointment, God preferred gardeners. It may be also suggested that to produce crops was a far harder task than shepherding, as the curse, remember the curse on the ground, in one sense, was a sentence to hard labour. Okay, that's the first idea. I think we dismiss that. Secondly, God accepted Abel's sacrifice because of blood sacrifice. Now, the immediate intention is that the cultic regulations of sacrifice indicate that both animal and grain offerings were acceptable to God under certain conditions. The grain offerings described in Leviticus 2, after prescriptions for the propitiatory burnt offering in Leviticus 1. So we can move on. Could talk about this for ages, but we can reasonably dismiss that. God accepted Abel's sacrifice based upon divine election. The notion of election, put simply, is God's perfect choice, and that notion belongs to a much later theological viewpoint, which really didn't have any popularity as the Reformation, 1517. So we can dismiss that one out of hand. Number 4, by faith, Abel offered God a more acceptable sacrifice than Cain. So, there's a suggestion about motivation here. The fault lay not in the materials that were offered, but in the person who brought the offerings. You see, basically, Abel believes God is good and merciful, and that reason he sacrificed pleasing to God. Cain, on the contrary, puts his trust in the privilege of primogeniture. In other words, he thought his brother was insignificant and a worthless being. That's Martin Luther's version. Now, a textual interpretation says that Cain offered only the fruit of the ground, as in some of the fruit of the ground, while Abel offered the flock and the portions. So, once again, we're looking at these things from a much later theological perspective. So, shall we have a little look, possibly, at something a little bit more realistic than the Reformation theologians put a lot of attention to, where the other church fathers looked at it, but that was part of their anti-Jewish thing, Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, first Jewish people, ultimate sinners, excuse me, and this old part of casting the Jewish people away. So, I think that we really need to have a whole look at the actual notice about the slaying. So, there are some questions that remain unanswered. What method did Cain employ to commit the murder? More importantly, where or how did he learn or pick up the knowledge how to kill? Well, what do you understand by the death of another human being by his own hand? Also, what did he do with the body? It's really quite ironic, in common with many texts, particularly those of narrative nature, what is considered to be a plain means that people who first heard this is meaning, as either no meaning or a number of meanings, to the people who weren't the first listeners. So-called plain meanings are very often viewed through a preconceived, theological, doctrinal, or what may be considered to be a traditional lens. Structurally, the narrator moves from a frame. Ancient writers are written in frames, which we might have explained. If not, let me explain. Ancient literature is written in frames, almost like you're looking at photo frames. If only you're old enough to remember colour photograph slides you put in a projector. Ancient writing is a little bit like that, put very simply. Okay, so as we say, plain readings are very often looked at through preconceived ideas. So there is a biblical consistency with younger and older brother motives. The dynamic of the sent the younger, or the youngest, is a quite frequent motive in biblical texts, particularly in Genesis, where the younger child is consistently raised above his or her siblings. Just some simple examples. Isaac over Ishmael, Jacob over Esau, Rachel over Leah, and Joseph over his brothers, and Ephraim over Manasseh. The ascent of David over his brothers will be a very outstanding view of this. So God's preference of Abel's offering over Cain's appears to be a starting point for this motif. However, Cain's response makes the deadliest, most extreme of these. It's worth pointing out at this juncture that little is said regarding Havel's position, his position in the fact-related relation. As I say, Havel, a vapour, it just appears. It's almost like it's a motif. Though, of course, etymological narratives are what they are. So there have been many attempts to provide a reason why Cain committed murder, and why his, and this is important, why his and his generations were destroyed in the deluge, which may go to our next session. I hope you're going to enjoy it, because we're going to have a little bit of fun with this. We're going to talk about Nephilim, the giants. We're going to talk about the deluge. But all these things are all part of the three-stranded cord, which will become very obvious as we move along. Now, there are many Jewish traditions that Eve had intercourse with the Satan, and Cain was actually the son of the Satan. For references for this, Louis Ginsburg wrote massively on this. So if you're interested in Jewish thought and history, let me recommend Louis Ginsburg's Legends of the Jews, from the creation to the Exodus. Well worth a read if you've got the time and the patience, and you're also interested. So let's just quickly move on, I've got time, to the method of Havel's murder. The account of Havel's slaying in Genesis met by textual silence regarding the method by which Cain murdered his brother. There are at least two primary questions. Firstly, where and how did he learn to kill? And secondly, what did with the body? As we said earlier, as all notices that will be bereft of detail in the scriptures, human nature will also always try and fill any lacunae with clever or informed conjecture, rationalistic explanations, and apocryphal sourced research, shall we say, derived from a number of traditions. In other Jewish sources, Genesis Rabbah, which the Jewish people hold in the highest regard. And remember, a Rabbah is a way of trying to explain things. Yeah. Cain, unfamiliar with the mechanics of death, effectively had a fit of bad temper and rained blows down on Havel until he found the fatal spot in the back of the neck, which broke his neck and killed him. The neck and its vital organs are further implicated in the act of strangulation or suffocation, a method alternatively suggested in the exegete Ambrosias's late 4th century work, which we won't detain ourselves with. In one of the ancient Hebraic texts that's held at the British Museum, there's a short sermon that relates that Cain first suffocated, then subsequently decapitated Havel with a jawbone, employing the teeth to soft his brother's head. Now, this obviously is maybe a later reflection on the story of Shimshon, who slayed the Philistines with the jawbone of an ass. So, I can give you at least 30 or 40 different Christian interpretations of this, which quite frankly don't make any sense whatsoever. Cain is basically represented as the progenitor, everything that's evil that came through these days and later. Now, the apocryphal Latin, just like Son of Jesus, Life of Adam and Eve, or the Apocalypse of Moses in the Greek version, collection of texts largely considered to be Jewish in origin and dating around about the time of Jesus, where he said that Eve dreamt about Adam's murder, seeing a vision that Cain mercilessly killed him and drank his brother's blood and vomited it forth on the earth. So as time goes on, we get more and more elaborate, more and more grotesque versions of what happened. So in the last 2 or 3 minutes, let's just try and get this very briefly, and I'll give you my view why this is part of the three-stranded cord. So, the Hebrew text shows very little interest in Havel, as do the rest of the canonical Old Testament. Now, curious enough, then Havel, as we said, vapor, breath, or is even translated as meaningless. He's not named by Adam and Eve, but is introduced by the narrator and referred to only by his relationship to Cain, his brother, a term employed 7 times in those very, very few verses. Think about it. Those few verses, 7 times. The brother, it seems like Havel has got no real role or purpose other than to be killed by Cain. It could be considered his presence is merely a foil for Cain's story in the narrative framework. So other than bringing the offering in his death, he plays no part whatsoever. So, I think we've looked pretty much at the text. In our last minute or two, I'm going to bring this together very quickly to say this. One of the main sins in the etiology narrative is jealousy. The narrative, now this Cain and Abel narrative. So, after Cain has slaughtered Abel, he goes off to land of Nod. There's a land of Nod in Yorkshire, it's on the town of Lucia, didn't go there. But went to this unknown place where he meets and marries. So the Catholic Church have tried to say that he married his twin brother's offspring, all kinds of other things. But it would seem that he went somewhere where there were other human beings. And as we said, it's important to note that Adam was taken and placed in Gan Eden. It wasn't created there, it was taken and placed there. And Cain goes somewhere else where he has prodigy. And then, of course, we get the story of Nimrod coming out of this. But sufficient to say, and I think this is very important as we conclude in our last few minutes. Murder, the greatest sin, and rebellion against God. So, in the story, the narrative, Adam and Eve, and now Cain and Abel, we get two things, don't we? Jealousy and rebellion against God. Rebellion against God means you're taken out from the land of promise. Taken out of Gan Eden. Cain is taken out from the land of promise and exiled away from it. So I hope you get the message. The three-stranded cord, God, land and people, runs through the entire etiological narrative. So, looking forward to seeing you next session, where we're going to look at the Nephilim, the giants, Noah's Ark, the deluge, and all the rather exciting things. In the meantime, God be with you until we meet again.